The Story Without a Name by Barbey d'Aurevilly, Chapter 9. One evening, Madame de Vergeul noticed certain symptoms that foretokened an early deliverance, and though the crisis had been long awaited, its attendant dangers alarmed her as they had not done before. They were solemn and menacing, and her untrained hands might easily render them tragic and mortal. By force of will, she mastered her nervousness and prepared for the task. Lastheny's sufferings left no room for doubt. During the night she was delivered. A little before, her mother muttered, "Bite the sheets so as to not cry out. Try to have courage." Lastheny had it. She did not utter a single cry, and even if she had, it would have not disturbed anyone in that house, to which night could not add a silence greater than it possessed by day. The only person who might have heard was Agatha, but she occupied a room at the other end of the chateau, a precaution which Madame de Vergeul's prudence had long since devised. Nevertheless, in spite of everything, during one moment the fear that comes of uncertainty beset her. She was sure that she was alone with her daughter, and yet with beating heart she crept and opened the door. She fancied Agatha crouching there. Such a thing was absurd, but no matter. She opened the door with that sinking of the heart which visits those who are not sure whether a spectre may not surge out of the black of night. In her case, the spectre would have been Agatha. Trembling, her dilated eyes, she peered down through the shadows of the corridor. There was no one there, trembling till she returned to the bed where her daughter writhed in agony. The infant must have been exhausted by the suffering of its mother. It was stillborn. Madame de Vergeul, who had reproached herself for hoping for a certain accident which the jolting vehicle might have caused, and thereby saved her daughter's future, could not help but be glad at the death for one which was to blame. She thanked God for the loss of the child, whom she had lugubriously christened Tristan. She blessed Providence for taking it from her before its birth. She and her daughter were spared new shames and fresh griefs. To her it was also a deliverance. Death had freed from her a child whom she would have had to hide during its lifetime, as she had hid it in its mother, and who, living, would have been empurpled Lastheny with that blush of shame which bastards put on their mother's cheek. "There is your crime, and its expiation." Lastheny looked at the child with its eyes that were dead as it, while through her broken body a shiver passed. "It's happier than I am," she murmured. Madame de Vergeul was watching her face, searching for a look of tenderness which it astonished her not to find. There was horror there, the eternal horror to that fate which seems to have dedicated the girl, but nothing of that which explains and absolves, no trace of love, nor yet of maternal affection. Involuntarily, Madame de Vergeul had counted on that supreme moment, but she had counted in vain. The mystery of Lastheny's soul was impenetrable. At that hour, there were certainly many women in the world giving birth to the fruit of illegitimate love, but there was there another, whose destinies resembled Lastheny? One on whom night and fear and death piled a triple shadow, in order that a nameless child of some nameless story might be forever hid? It was a night of agonies, and there was still another to be endured. The child happily was dead, but its body was there, and the last vestige of shame Madame de Vergeul knew must disappear. Lastheny had fallen asleep. Madame de Vergeul took the corpse, and, rolling it in one of the swaddling cloths at which she had worked during the silent hours she had passed at her daughter's side, she left the girl in the room, locking the door behind her as she went. Presently she was in the garden. An old spade was there, she remembered, and with it, in the angle of the wall, she dug a grave for the child. Hurriedly her hands trembled and humiliated. "I bury it as though I killed it," she thought, and with the fright of guilt she stamped down the earth on what might have been her grandchild. Then she returned to the room where Lastheny still slept. When she later awoke, she asked no questions. She appeared to have forgotten the child. Madame de Vergeul noticed this, and waited, wondering whether she should speak of it first. But monstrous as it may seem, she neither spoke of it then or later on. Only her tears flowed continuously, as before, and when at last she was sufficiently recovered to leave her bed, she seemed as ill as she had been at first. There was the same weakness, the same pallor, the same stupor, the same self-concentration, the same frightened expression, the same dementia. The dishonoring blow which her mother had dealt her at her innocence, joined to the inexplicability of her condition, had put a wound in her that still bled, one that would never heal. Madame de Fragile, reassured by the knowledge that the secret of her daughter's dishonor was now a thing of the past, became gentler, and, being a Christian, charitable and lenient too. Her customary irritability disappeared. The irreparable was to her like death, a thing to be accepted. But with Lasthany it was different. She declined to accept the irreparable. Of the two women, it was the weaker who showed the greater strength. Her relations with her mother did not alter, neither did she raise her head. She was pitiless. That dagger which resentment is she kept in the wound it had created. Agatha, who during the time the girl was in bed had hoped for some favorable change in her disorder, seeing now by her languor and unceasing tears that the prospect of amelioration was slight, returned to her former belief in the devil and his spells, and asked permission to make a pilgrimage to the tomb of the blissful Thomas de Bavelle, a permission which Madame de Fragile accorded. Agatha started off barefoot, with that faith of medieval pilgrims which, in spite of the progress of contemporary incredulity, still abides in Normandy. 4 days later she returned, but sadder than when she started. The miracle that she had demanded in the security of her perfect faith seemed to her now remote, perhaps unobtainable. For, on reaching Hollande, there in the moonlight she found a coffin stretched across the road. She had tried to move it, but could not, and suddenly it had disappeared. In the superstitions of the land, in which she firmly believed, an experience such as this was an evil omen, the presage of coming death. The next day, however, Lasthany seemed to her a trifle better than before, and it could not have been the apparition. She would have attributed the slight amelioration to the pilgrimage. She told Madame de Fragile all the circumstances of her journey, but said nothing of the coffin. What is the use? She reflected. She would not believe me. But Madame de Fragile did believe in prayer, and in the miracles which prayers produced, and she told Agatha that Lasthany already felt better for those that had been offered to her at the tomb of the saint. I intend to go to Mass myself presently, she added. Now Agatha had not missed one, and she had excited no more curiosity in the church than she had at the market-place. To the assistants she was but one peasant more. But what was possible to Agatha was impossible for her mistress. As soon then as Madame de Fragile felt that the time had come when she could attend holy worship, she experienced a sensation, not of joy, for the condition of her daughter made her far too melancholy for that, but of something that dilated her heart, so long and so horribly compressed. In the native common sense which had never deserted her, and in the appreciation of the realities of life, she knew that now she and her daughter must abandon the incognito which they had thus far preserved. In consequence, she gave Agatha certain instructions. She told her to tell the tenantry of her arrival, to explain that she had come because of her daughter's health, to whom a change of the air was necessary, and to add that until her daughter was fully recovered, she could receive no one. These precautions were needless. It was not a time when people received or made visits. The revolution was galloping like a fever. The crisis of delirium was at hand. The two miserable chatelaines of Hollande, overcome by the domestic tragedy of what their dwelling was, knew absolutely nothing of the political tragedy which was going to have France for a stage. Madame de Fragile talked of going to Mass. In a moment there would be none for her to attend, nor one of those altars to kneel at, which are the columns where every broken heart should lean.